Hello everyone, this is Mr. Davis, and this is going to be today's review for cell transport, and it's also going to include some practice problems for you to do in your unit notebook. As you remember, there are two major types of cell transport. Passive, that requires absolutely no energy to do it, and then the opposite, active, requires and needs energy to push the molecules across the cell membranes of the cells. You must know two things in order to determine if cell transport is passive or active. And those two things are the gradient and the direction that the particles are moving. So when you see these on exam questions and in the practice pretty soon, you're going to want to make sure you can see where there is more and where there is less particles, and that gives you the gradient. Where there's more is going to be a high concentration of particles, and then obviously where there's less is going to be your low concentration of particles. So let's start with just a little bit of background vocab as well with regard to gradient. You want to note that if the particles are moving from the high concentration toward the low concentration, that's going to be described as moving with the gradient, and it sometimes can be called going down the gradient. But if it's going in the opposite direction, if it's going from where there's less to where there's more, that's going to be described as going against the gradient or up the gradient, as if it's trying to travel uphill. So anything going up or against the gradient is very simple, and you should always know that this is going to be active transport. Because in order to go against the grain or against the gradient, it's going to need to require energy, and that energy is going to be ATP in the cell. So if you're going to look at active transport microscopically, you would see along the cell membrane that there's these little tiny proteins that act almost as doors to shove those particles, in a sense, the wrong way. Because otherwise, the high concentration over here would naturally want to push the particles that way. But with the help of ATP and those protein pumps, those particles can be shoved up or against the gradient. And that is your example of active transport. Passive transport is going to be just as easily recognizable, because every time you see the direction going from high concentration to low, that is always going to be passive transport of some type, because it's the high concentration that is literally trying to spread out, and it's always going to be spreading towards where there is less molecules of that particular molecule already. So if you see it going from high to low, that's always going to be some type of passive transport. And now you're finally going to want to know that there's actually two types of passive transport that are very, very similar, except there's one tiny difference. So we already know that if it's going across the membrane from high to low, that is passive transport. But if it's going straight across, like it's a super tiny, tiny molecule like water or carbon dioxide or oxygen, they can literally go directly through the microscopic holes in the cell membrane. And that's going to be called something that is going to be called simple diffusion. Simple meaning it doesn't need any help and it's going directly through the holes all by itself. Simple diffusion. And finally, the second type of passive transport is something called facilitated diffusion. And if you remember during lecture and in class, facilitated simply means helped. So it's still passive, so it's going from high concentration to low concentration. But along the cell membrane, there's proteins that help move those particles down the gradient even faster. So along the microscopic pores of the cell membrane, there's going to be little doors that swing open to help these things go through here faster. But remember, it's still pushed by the high concentration behind it going to low, so it still requires no energy whatsoever. And again, that is called facilitated diffusion. Now that we're done with the drawing, please know that at any time you can go back and review the drawings and my explanation as we go. So if you get stuck on these practice problems, you should go back and rewatch those examples, and it's also something you could use at home to review as well. Please go to the next page in your unit notebook. Okay, so you just did some photosynthesis problems, and you could do these right after that or on the same page if they fit. Please draw these sketches and then identify them as active or passive transport. But if it's passive, please see if you can tell if it's simple or facilitated diffusion. Now finally, please pause the video here at the end so you can keep the practice problems available and start copying those down and raising your hand when you need help.